Well, hi, I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership and engineering. Hey, in this episode, I would like to talk about situational leadership. Now, in most cases, what you'll find is I'm just excited about all the leadership theories. I'm just going to say right up front, this one really irritates me, probably more than all the others combined. But at any rate, so let's dive in as always and looking at what we really know as opposed to just opinion and that sort of thing. So the first thing about situational leadership, even though I know a lot of companies still train to it, it's a lot of there's all this hullabaloo. It is an old theory. So it was originally published, I think, in 1969, and that's very significant, the age. It's not necessarily because it's old, it's bad. I mean, I have a video on theory X and theory Y, and that's older, and that's old too, but it's still applicable. The thing is in the world of organizational leadership and leadership studies, there was something right around 2000, 2005 that people call the affective revolution. So what is that? So affect is kind of an umbrella term for mood and emotion and all that touchy-feely stuff. And that term, by the way, came from Barsati and Gibson in one of their papers. But what it was is kind of collectively all the theorists realized, wait a minute, emotions matter and how you feel at work matters. And all of a sudden there's just this huge change to realize, as a leader, you're in the people business and emotions count and all these sort of things. Before the affective revolution, there were people researching leadership, a few, and right about since then, there's just been this explosion where, there's probably more papers in 6 months published on leadership each 6 months than there were in the entire decade of the 1980s. At any rate, some modern leadership theories, transformational leadership, authentic leadership, servant leadership, leader-member exchange, humble leadership, there's several others. Situational leadership is just simply not in that group. It's an old theory. It's historically very significant because it was one of the first theories that brought focus to the idea that leadership was more than a trait, and then it sort of started the moving responsibility to the leader. And prior to that, it was kind of like you lead everybody the same, you treat everybody the same, and it was historically significant that also this idea that I need to sort of adapt to the follower, and so that was a good thing. It's just kind of frozen in time. I mean, I went to the website situational.com yesterday and poked around a little bit. And here's a timeline, sort of leading up to, what was the theory based on. And I'm showing you the entire chart. I'm not clipping things off, So scientific management, 1911. Okay, so scientific management right now, that should be a concern that somebody mentions that, because that was the whole make an assembly line, dehumanize, everybody's an equation kind of thing. So the fact we want to reference that is horrifying. And then in 1933, 1948, 1954, 1957, theory X, theory Y, 1964, 1966, 1965, like that's just putting in your face. This thing's frozen in time. The last bit of research that preceded situational leadership was from 1965. It's an old theory, and really, if you even look at some of those, like David McClelland's achievement theory and stuff, it doesn't address all of it. I mean, he had need for achievement, need for affiliation, need for power. How that fits in, it's not even clear to me. At any rate, we'll do a video on that sometime. But at any rate, and a lot of these things, how these I mean, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's a good one. How does that actually fit into situational leadership? There's so many things about it that aren't explicit. When you talk to the proponents, they're like, oh, well, no, it's not explicit, but it's here. See, there's room for it here. What you really want is a theory that's explicit and says these are the key ideas. And you don't want a theory that you have to sort of explain. At best, you explain how it doesn't contradict. At any rate, so another thing, it was originally by Ken Blanchard and Paul Hersey, and then that was situational leadership, and situational leadership 2, some revisions. That's just Blanchard's. He's the 1 minute manager guy. he has a company. They, sort of train people in it. There's almost no published data. I think the whole time in my PhD, when I was a student, I think I was able to find 3 papers on it. Let's contrast that. I read a literature review on transformational leadership, and they had identified like 2,000 journal articles. So, 3 articles, 2,000, a huge percentage of which were empirical. Why is it around? I think because sometimes you have people who are responsible to train these things. They just want to be trained how to train it, and it's more about just oh good, there's existing material. I'll just present it and so on. It's convenient. All right. Anyway. So how does situational leadership work? So what you'll do is you'll see a grid like this. There's 4 grids, and it kind of moves from lower right to ultimately to lower left. So it kind of goes lower right, upper left, lower left. And the idea is these are, you see here, the SL2, there's sort of 4 different modes the leader. And first the leader's in telling mode, then the leader's in selling mode, and leader's in participating mode and delegating. Well, what's that? Well, if you look at the x-axis, so from right to left, it's sort of to what extent do you have to be directive, so for instance, that first one there, the green one, the leader's telling you do this, and the last one is completely delegating, trusting them. So it kind of moves from the leader having to tell a lot to not too much. And then up and down, you have this relationship behavior, and it sort of starts with this idea of, the leader's not, there's not much of a relationship, and there gets to be a relationship, and then all of a sudden we diminish the relationship. Another one of my beefs. And then what it does on the bottom there, it kind of then says from the follower's perspective, they're sort of where they're at, that's the low performance, moderate, and high, and wherever you want to do is get everybody over there to R4 and stuff. So, that's basically it. And, the thing is, it does give you a good way to think about leadership. I mean, it gives you a way to think about leadership. So not having any way to think about leadership is bad. Having some way to think about leadership is better. And it really does highlight that you don't want to treat everybody the same way. So those are goods. So, what's the bad news then? Why does this theory bug me? Well, for one thing, if you look at what's known about leadership, there's this enormous amount of, just all these different things. And situational leadership addresses one issue, which is, sometimes you need to adapt to the situation. Okay, well, it doesn't address what about leader humility, what about leader altruism, what about casting a vision, what about leader charisma, what about intellectual stimulation, what about the influence of follower personality, what about leader transparency. I mean, I can go on and on where other theories, the more comprehensive ones, are useful, and they really give you some direction, where this thing, really doesn't say very much. I already mentioned there's not much research on it. And then there's some things that they're just plain wrong. More recent research, so for instance, it suggests that, as you move from the first square to the second square, that your competency goes up, but your motivation goes down, which is why the leader has to have more relational involvement. Okay, we know that to be false. As you gain competence, you gain internal motivation. That's what the data shows. So the first box there in lower right suggests telling as a leadership activity. Okay, well, maybe if you're working at McDonald's and you got a bunch of 18-year-olds you're trying to teach how to do hamburgers, great. With engineers and with millennials, either case, and especially with engineers who are millennials, okay, the whole telling thing doesn't work real well. The whole idea of leadership these days has to be about interacting and relating and asking questions and that sort of thing. And certainly with technical experts, this whole telling thing just doesn't work. On the lower left, the idea that as you really get strong, then the leader sort of reduces the relationship with the follower. I mean, that is just awful. Brian Herndon had a great PhD dissertation. It was about 2007. His opening sentences, leadership is about relationships, And what always happens is the more you develop this relationship with the people you follow, the relationship should always build in time. And this idea that we're sort of suggesting to the leader that, okay, they've got past this point, you can sort of, turn down the relationship. Okay, that is the very opposite of modern leadership theory. Leadership is about relationships, and you build those over time. The followership theory suggests that employee engagement is critical. You just always want that engagement. And another point is, it presents this simplistic view of leadership. I mean, in 1969, it was kind of an advance, but there's so much it doesn't have, that what I've seen in the workplace is it gives people who desperately need to learn about leadership this false sense that they understand leadership. I mean, there's one leader I know who, is just is a manager but not a leader, and they've got the little chart thing up in their cube, and it's like, wow, not a leader at all. And this, you kind of they feel like because they know this that they're done learning about leadership. And in fact, they even told me that one time that they don't have to learn anymore because they know it. That just drives me crazy. At any rate, so are there alternatives? There's dozens, but let me throw out a couple: transformational leadership, servant leadership, humble leadership, and authentic leadership. Transformational leadership. There's so many articles. Hey, there's a book called The Leadership Challenge by Kouzes and Posner. I think they just revised it a year or two ago. It's in its 5th or 6th edition. They've got, like if you get a couple thousand survey responses and base your theory on that, that's a pretty nice theory. They have 700,000 surveys now that they're basing their theory on. It is the most heavily researched leadership theory in the history of the world, and it's much broader. And it's got you can point to a book and say, read this, and they got other stuff. They got workbooks, and they got other there's a whole thing. Much better choice. There's servant leadership. Robert Greenleaf's book, that's got a much more developed ideas. That's a good one. University I went to was real big. Regent University was real big on servant leadership, and so that's kind of near and dear to my heart. Probably the most exciting leadership theory, the one I'm just excited about, is humble leadership, which is Edgar Schein's newest thing, built on just decades and decades of his research into leadership and culture and things of that nature. At any rate, all of that is to say that I guess, I acknowledge situational leadership had its place historically. It was important in the late 60s. It was kind of a turning point. But I would beg you, if you're involved in teaching leadership, like, stop teaching this. It is an old, out of date, and insufficient model. And it just kind of amazes me this thing still has legs. There's so much better stuff available that you can do better than situational leadership. At any rate, so that was an uncharacteristically negative video, but like I say, this is the one theory that just really bugs me. But if you like want to hear about other things in a slightly more positive note, like I have a real nice thing on millennials I just did, and I'm actually the one guy on the planet who thinks millennials are great and kind of pro-millennial. But at any rate, you can go to tomulrichconsulting.com, and there's pull downs. You can see my videos there. You can just go right to YouTube, and if you search on Dr. Tom Ulrich, that comes up. And I was kind of hoping that if you could set my moniker, engineering leadership guy, kind of like that as a name. If you search on that, it actually aliases to a lot of things, but you'll find me too. But probably go to my website. That's probably your best bet. At any rate, thanks for letting me rant a little bit. We will talk to you later.